Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Fireside Chats. I'm James Nagler, and today we have
Diego Cadeva,
Sophia Rigo,
and Kate Pogazowski.
I recently saw in the news Biden's new economic plan on the White House website, and I noticed some Keynesian influence, which is direct government intervention in the economy, that drew some parallels with other economic plans over time.
I agree. I think that giving the $1,400 stimulus checks, along with the unemployment benefits, is a clear continuity of the Keynesian economic ideas, along with the tax credits for kids.
And we see these actions date back to the founding of the nation and Hamilton's first national bank to help pay off war debts. He argued a national bank would facilitate this through taxation and centralization. It was heavily contested by states' rights-oriented politicians such as Thomas Jefferson, but it was inevitably signed into law in 1791.
Although the bank didn't end up being chartered for a second time, as Jackson hated the power he believed the bank had over the people, the Keynesian beliefs didn't end and lived on with Henry Clay's American system. He tried to pass laws based on a strong government presence in the economy with tariffs, a national bank, and internal improvements like canals. I think that if his programs weren't shut down, they would have reached great success for the burgeoning nation.
Even though they didn't get to shut down, it gave rise to FDR's New Deal, the main proponent of Keynesian economics. The success of the 1920s led to many different things. We have the creation of new products that caused credit lending for a lot of the middle class and other class buying new products, but due to the credit lending, it inevitably led to the stock market crash of 1929. Now, this led to the Great Depression, which was not uncommon in the decades prior with many other different recessions, but the Great Depression was so drastic and so severe in its consequences that it really called for a drastic change to take place in the economic situation of the times.
Some of these drastic changes that were introduced by FDR's administration were some of the alphabet soups in the New Deal policies, such as the PWA, the CCC, the TVA, and especially the FDIC, which insured people's bank money up to $250,000. These were all part of the plans for relief, recovery, and reform. And along with that, the introduction of Medicare and Medicaid were parts of direct government intervention in the economy like it had never happened before. And this shows a change in time of the government interaction in the economy.
The New Deal ideologies after then did not emerge in quite the same way until LBJ's Great Society in the 1960s.
Absolutely. LBJ tried to address poverty throughout the nation through his Office of Economic Opportunity and Community Action Programs to give direct relief to the people. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to address the rising wealth gap in society and inevitably failed.
It also failed because he couldn't have guns and butter, that is, fighting a war abroad and fighting a war domestically. This has been a continuity over time, and unfortunately, LBJ's legacy is tied with the Vietnam War and not his Great Society.
I think one of the more recent examples of Keynesianomics is Obamacare, which is actually called the Affordable Care Act. Now, similar to other Keynesian economic policies, which increased aggregate demand by increasing government spending, it helped to increase spending in the Medicare and Medicaid fields, and it also reduced the federal deficit. This is a stark contrast to supply-side economics like Reagan, which we'll talk about later, but that was against Keynesian economics and it increased the federal deficit spending.
But I think we should mention the strong pushback of all of these policies, especially in recent years.
Before we get to that, let's read a word from our sponsor, Founding Fashions. Are you tired of modern fashion trends? Do you yearn for the stylish days of powdered wigs and waistcoats? Introducing Founding Fashions, the revolutionary clothing line for those who want to dress like it's 1776. Slip into our authentic replica breeches, tri-cornered hats, and elegant gowns. With Founding Fashions, you'll be the talk of every tea party and the envy of every delegate. Save 10% off your next order with the code FIRESIDE. Now, let's continue your discussion on Keynesian pushback, Diego.
Some people viewed this government intervention with FDR's policies as socialist, and this was amplified by FDR's court packing scheme, where he attempted to pack the Supreme Court and other federal courts that had found his alphabet soup policies unconstitutional. And this idea of minimal government intervention goes all the way back to the classical views of the Jacksonian era, where he didn't want any big central government. He had a desire to end the national bank, and he supported Jefferson in his view of the yeoman farmer leading America.
That's a great example, Diego, but I think that the best example of classical economics was Hoover during the Great Depression. Classical economics boils down to one simple principle, and that is that government cannot influence the economy.
Yeah, and following this, Hoover did just that. absolutely nothing and believed the economy would self-correct. This belief created so-called Hoovervilles, which are areas across the country where poverty-stricken workers blame their downfall on Hoover's resignation in the economy.
Besides classical pushback, there was a strong pushback with monetarist views. That is, the belief that only changes in the money supply can affect the economy. The main proponent of this was Milton Friedman and his monetary theory of exchange, MV equals PY. And this would later go on to influence Laffer's theory, which is not really the topic of this discussion, but it influenced Nixon, Reagan, and later Trump. And their belief was that the government should be able to control the money supply directly and go over the Fed's head.
And that ties in perfectly with the final opposition to Keynesian economics, supply side and Reaganomics. Those rose along with the rise of new conservatism in the mid-1900s. Reaganomics and trickle-down economics are built upon the ideas that deregulation and cutting taxes is the ideal scenario for a good economy. This led to massive federal deficit, and Trump followed these principles and applied these same exact policies of deregulation and deficit spending.
You make some compelling points. Look at this holistically. I see a general trend over time to a government that barely participates in the economy to a government that has heavily regulated, although fluctuating on administration, the economy.
I also think it parallels the development of new economic policies of government involvement like Keynesian economics. I think this development can be first seen by Jefferson and his agrarian model of government. The states retain primary control while the government takes a backseat in the economy.
And this laissez-faire model continues all throughout the Gilded Age into the late 19th century, where we have the rise of industrial capitalism, a lack of regulation, where industrial tycoons like Carnegie and Rockefeller amassed large amounts of wealth, the wealth gap increased, but the standard of living increased. This caused regulation from Teddy Roosevelt as part of his Square Deal and trust busting, but this was part of a larger movement of progressivism, and it inevitably led an end to the massive laissez-faire economy of the Gilded Age.
The Progressive Era was the predecessor for the economic policies of the New Deal, which led to the Great Society, the Office of Economic Opportunities, the Community Action Programs, and helping the poor. They ended up failing because guns and butter would not work since the U.S. was fighting a war in Vietnam that was very costly. That led to Reaganomics, which was the start of varying involvement of the federal government in the economy with different administrations.
Speaking of variation, Obama goes against Reagan and provided direct relief in the economy through Obamacare and stimulus checks to directly influence the economy. Trump then went back to Reagan with his deregulation and tax cuts, decreasing his influence on the economy to appeal to the Republicans.
And finally, we have Biden, who went back to Obama and provided direct relief for the people. Overall, I think in times of recession in the economy, the government takes a stronger role to appease voters and try to benefit the public through economic reform.
And I think without a strong influence in the economy, new economic policies from the government wouldn't be a major voting topic. The more involved the government is in the economy, the more different economic programs have an influence on politics and voting. Now, before we summarize this podcast, let's hear a word from our second sponsor, Revolutionary Ringtones. Tired of hearing the same old ringtones everywhere you go? Want to add some historical flair to your phone? Introducing Revolutionary Ringtones. Unlock the spirit of the past with our exclusive collection of iconic historical sounds. Hear George Washington's inspiring speeches, the fife and drum of the Revolutionary War, or even the clinking of coins from the California Gold Rush every time your phone rings. Impress your friends and transport yourself to pivotal moments in history with Revolutionary Ringtones.
And now on to a conclusion on the influence of economic policies on the government. The future of economic policies will probably appear to have greater centralization with greater influence in the economy, but there will be a vast amount of fluctuation in policies between different parties taking the presidential office. As a whole, the government will have to regulate the economy more as new aspects of the economy develop. I think that wraps it up. Stay tuned for next week's topic on Fireside Chats, Double Jeopardy, with the special case of O.J. Simpson. Did he do it? We'll find out next week. We will also use O.J.'s trial to illustrate the effect public perception has on the outcome of trials in the American criminal justice system. And mark your calendars, because in 2 weeks we have a special live podcast episode with Ken Burns, where we will be discussing the impacts of his books on the American perception of their past.
Bye!
Disclaimer: no photos were taken during the production of this podcast.